Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hampstead Synagogue online. And for those of you who are watching overseas on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, just to explain that Hampstead Synagogue is an Orthodox community based in London, England, and we were founded in 1892, still in our original building, one of the so-called cathedral synagogues of the United Kingdom. Our parent organization is the United Synagogue under the religious leadership of the Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis. Tonight, we continue our series, Where Are We Now? And it's an opportunity for us to take stock and find out how the community is faring under the threat of the virus, and more particularly, the challenges that we're going to be facing in the immediate post-corona era, which I think we're beginning to believe in now as things start to relax here in the UK at the very least. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is to introduce you to our special panel. And our panel will be looking at a particular aspect of this issue and this crisis, and that is the family unit. And I think we are best placed tonight to find out how the family has been faring with our guests. And if I may first introduce you to Naomi Dickson. Naomi became Chief Executive of Jewish Women's Aid in 2014. She's been involved in JWA for 18 years. In her previous role as its communications and training coordinator, she raised awareness of domestic abuse in the Jewish community and helped empower communal professionals to better identify and support women and children affected by it. The work still continues. JWA launched the DINA Sexual Violence Support Service in 2019. It is a specialist support service for Jewish women and girls aged 16 and over who have experienced sexual violence. Naomi is a trustee of Women's Aid Federation England, a founder of the Faiths Against Domestic Abuse Coalition, and a fellow of the Cambridge Senior Faith Leadership Programme. Her Honour Judge Rachel Karp is a circuit judge with considerable experience in family cases. She has been a family tutor judge for the Judicial College. In addition to her sittings at the Family Court at Barnet, she is the Judicial College Coordinator for International Training. Her Honour has graciously allowed me to refer to her by her first name tonight, and I should also point out that Rachel will be speaking in a personal capacity this evening. Islington Gazette in June 2016 reported that as a real district judge, Rachel oversaw proceedings at a karaoke court where angry neighbours, disgruntled employees, and argumentative friends could resolve their legal qualms by singing karaoke in front of an audience jury. The jury decided who won each case by voting for their favourite litigant. The sing-off at the Yard Theatre in Hackney Wick was even legally binding, with participants signing an arbitration contract before they started their vocal battle. And I worried about the person who sang "I Shot the Sheriff," but we'll pass on that. Let's go now to Laurie Rackind. Laurie was appointed the first Chief Executive of the Jewish Association for Mental Illness, known as JAMI, in 2007. He graduated from Warwick with a degree in engineering and business studies, and after spending 5 years in financial modelling at the London Business School, went on to 13 years with his own specialist engineering company serving the process industries. Under Laurie's direction, JAMI has developed various partnership and collaborative initiatives, most notably the creation of a single mental health service for the Jewish community in London and the South East with the charity Jewish Care. And I should add that my name is Gabriel Herman, and together with Madeleine Abramson, we are the co-chairs of Hampstead Synagogue, and you'll be meeting Madeleine later on this evening. Now, wherever you're watching this, whether it's on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, please do make comments as we go along, and hopefully I'll be able to bring those comments to you here in the meeting with your questions. But you also might actually explain your experiences over lockdown particularly, and we can have that as part of the discussion too. So please feel free to use the messaging facilities in the social media that we're using tonight. Okay, so I think we're ready to get things started. And so if I may, first of all, come to Naomi. All those months ago, in April the 20th in particular, that was International Women's Day. And I know that JWA launched a confidential live web chat service. I wondered if we could start by saying, how has technology changed over this particular period in lockdown? Naomi, over to you.
Thank you. And before I start, Gabriel, just thank you so much for inviting me onto this panel this evening with these really impressive co-panelists. It's really an important subject to discuss. Just to give you a little bit of background context about Jewish Women's Aid, we support around 700 Jewish women each year and their children. And we do it in lots and lots of different ways, technology just being one of them. But it's certainly absolutely correct to say that over the last few months since lockdown, technology has played a much more important part in how we support women and their children. Like all other organisations, we've pivoted to doing absolutely everything remotely, and that includes casework, initial conversations, counselling sessions, therapy for children, and of course the web chat which you mentioned, which we were so pleased to launch fairly early on in lockdown, because what that does is it gives women an opportunity to reach our services without actually having to speak. And why that's important is because since lockdown started, a lot of people will have seen, I'm sure, the media reports about domestic abuse increasing hugely. There's been a large amount, sadly, of homicides nationally. We would normally expect around 2 per week, which is an awful number anyway, but that's really gone through the roof. And all the domestic violence helplines and services have experienced a huge surge in demand for support from women affected by domestic abuse. And of course, that does include Jewish Women's Aid. We know that domestic abuse happens across the breadth of every part of society, including across the breadth of the Jewish community. And our web chat has really played into that, because what that has meant is that women have been able to access our services quietly without the knowledge necessarily of the perpetrator who they're living with. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've solved the problem, though, because what we know and what other domestic abuse agencies are also telling us is that post-lockdown, we are very, very likely to see an increased spike in demand for our services. Lockdown is a very well-intentioned measure which has unfortunately been used by perpetrators to increase the amount of abuse that women are experiencing. They're telling us that they're feeling more anxious, they're more prone to physical abuse, children are witnessing more abuse, and also they're feeling incredibly more traumatized. We're seeing more demands for welfare, grants, more demands for emergency accommodation. And that's all really frightening for us as an organisation, because it's much harder for us to reach the women who need our services. And actually what we need to do at the moment is, in addition to be here for the women who need us, we're also preparing for the spike in demand, which we anticipate happening after lockdown ends.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And I think we'll come back to how the courts are going to be reacting to an uptake on criminality in a few moments. But first of all, if I can come to Laurie here and ask you the same question, how has technology changed how you interact with your clients?
Totally. And again, if I could start by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to be here this evening. Technology has completely changed the way that we've interacted with those using our services. In many ways, I think we had plans to digitally transform our service, but it probably would have happened over the next 2 or 3 years. And I think what the pandemic has done has accelerated that process. Immediately the pandemic hit, we had to very quickly risk assess those using our services. At any one time, there's about 1,300 people directly using JAMI services. And my service colleagues quickly identified around about 350 or 400 of the most isolated and most vulnerable service users who absolutely needed our support straight away. Now, we realized that in the main, that was going to have to be through digital platforms and devices. But in the main, the vast majority of our service users didn't have those devices, didn't have Wi-Fi, just had no means of staying in contact. So we very quickly had to get hold of, in the main, there were tablet computers with SIM cards, and we very quickly distributed them to those most in need. Added to that, alongside those deliveries, we were delivering hot meals to some of our service users who, coming to our centres, and we have eight hubs effectively across London, coming to those hubs might be the only hot meal that they get during the week. So we were delivering in hot meals, we were delivering, as I said, the tablet computers, and we were having doorstep chats. And I have to say, the doorstep chats were probably amongst the most important interventions of the lot. And to directly answer your question, I think you mentioned in your preamble that I started my career, I'm a qualified engineer, and I started my career as a software engineer, and I never got into Computer Weekly as a software engineer. I'm proud to say that JAMI was in Computer Weekly 3 weeks ago as a prime example of a social care organisation that embraced the use of technology in getting to service users. So it's been a complete transformational shift.
And thank you for that question, because it's the virtual and the real world that we've got to be concerned about. There was a member of our community who we knew was in contact with us virtually. There was emails going backwards and forwards, and he was being phoned and all the rest of it, but actually wanted the human interaction. And I was trying to work out what he meant. And you're right, going to somebody's house and speaking through a window or speaking through the letterbox was actually more important than the what else we were doing virtually. So there's two parts of this, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on this evening. But I also want to make sure that this is not going to be a discussion just about our institutions, but we can also reflect individually about our experiences and the people that we've come across over this time as well, for the human dimension. But if I can come to Rachel now, obviously the courts have had to act in a very different way. And I wonder if, on reflecting on what Naomi said, that there are things that we should know are going on behind closed doors. How have the family courts particularly been able to keep functioning at this time?
Well, we started off from a model that was very much in the 19th century and unchanged, of oral hearings, and having to move pretty much overnight into trying to deliver at least the emergency applications digitally, often from closed courts on really Heath Robinson type setups at home, people using their own personal devices, and being very aware of the fact that the litigants are often sometimes in the same room as their opponent, often with children around them who should not be hearing the content of court hearings. So it's been quite a challenging environment. So we started off really just dealing with emergency cases. And as Naomi mentioned, there's been a huge increase in the number of domestic violence injunctions that we've dealt with in the courts. One of the surprising gains, though, I think, has been we were about to pilot a scheme where rather than a victim having to face their perpetrator in court, of having a sort of distant video link where the applicants were in one setting and the respondents in another setting to trial this. Well, all pilots went out of the window, and the whole country is now operating in that way, and that the initial hearings and orders are frequently granted on a paper application with then a telephone hearing a few days later. We've had actually greater rather than lesser take up of respondents to those applications because they're being dialed in on their telephone. And we've had some funny situations of people who are in Tesco's when suddenly they're phoned by the court and having to take part in a court hearing that they've forgotten about. We've had children dive bombing into hearings that we're conducting, and we've just had to be flexible to do the best we can to keep the system going, because families are a pressure cooker. Everybody's been at home. The vulnerable families that local authorities were just about managing to keep safe with support from school, after clubs, all those supports were falling apart. And so there have been some serious breakdowns of family units, of foster placements where foster carers could no longer cope. So there has been a number of challenges which continue. And we're now looking at how we can increase the amount of cases that we can actually hear, as well as firefighting, which I think was the beginning of the exercise.
Thank you. And coming back to what Naomi said, that there are kind of hidden crimes behind closed doors that obviously were able to happen because of lockdown. But I think the public perception was that crime rates disappeared almost all overnight because people couldn't get up to nefarious things outside. I wonder how true that is, and whether there's going to be a logjam of cases coming up as we emerge out of lockdown, and there could be a crisis within the judicial system.
Well, there's certainly a huge backlog in. I'm not
Rachel?
a criminal judge. Yes, can you hear me? Hello.
Can we hear Rachel?
Can you hear me?
I can't hear
Yes.
Rachel.
There's a huge. I'm not a criminal judge, but there's a massive backlog in the criminal courts. There was already a huge backlog of jury trials. It has increased incrementally, and there are discussions currently afoot. The Lord Chief Justice has been discussing whether or not jury trials should be suspended for lower value claims, or that juries themselves should be cut to be 7 people rather than 10 people, which would increase the capacity of some courts to be able to then hear cases socially distanced. So there's a huge piece of work to try to increase the volume of cases rather than just continue to build the backlog.
You're probably going to gather that I can't hear anything at the moment. So I'm going to ask Madeline in a moment if she can come to camera and perhaps ask a question. And then what I'm going to try and do is dial out and dial in again and see if I can rejoin the meeting. So I apologize for this, but if you can hear me, that's great. If you can't, I can't hear anything. So can I just go over to you can hear me, right? I'll go over to Madeline now.
Okay. Laurie's being interrupted, but Laurie, what would you say has been the main problem that you have encountered in COVID, in the sense of the effect on the family over this period?
Well, clearly my answer would be with 4 children. That's
Constant interruption.
I think, look, it's interesting. I know we're here, this evening to focus on the impact on family groups. For an awful lot of our users, they're not living in traditional family groups. A lot of them are already isolated, and one of the challenges for us is that you introduce weapons of isolation and physical distancing, but for people that are already isolated, that's a huge problem. In terms of the impact on families, we already know that the stats tell us that between 60 and 70% of family of carers and family members of those with significant mental health issues are likely to develop depression and anxiety themselves. Now, clearly, in periods of lockdown, that is exacerbated, not only for people that are actually living in the same family unit, but for people whose support will struggle because obviously they can't even get to their loved ones and get to their other family members. So it's a real concern. It was just mentioned that at the outset, the levels of crime didn't change. The reporting of it and the dealing of it might have been different. It's a bit like saying mental health didn't increase as lockdown started. It did. What happened was that everything focused on a direct COVID response, and JAMI and other mental health services and other statutory services saw a drop in almost all provisions, certainly in terms of mental health referrals. What's happening now is clearly all that was still bubbling under, if you like, and growing, is now starting to hit the proverbial fan. And we're getting an increase in referrals now. And that's the challenge. We always knew that the mental health curve was going to follow the COVID curve. We're now starting to see that in numbers. And already my colleagues are offering 50% more interventions than they were pre-COVID. And that's with the same staff team. So it really is a challenge.
Naomi, are you seeing the same pattern at JWA of referrals going up now that lockdown is decreasing?
Yes, I mean, we saw at the beginning of lockdown, there was a slight lull, actually similar to what Laurie was saying. And And then suddenly we had a huge increase in demand. We've had about a third more women seeking support from us than we would normally expect to see at this time of year. And additionally, each of those women who we're working with is needing about a third more hours in terms of staff support than they usually would do. And that doesn't seem to be decreasing. We're seeing more high risk cases, meaning more women coming to us with complexities around mental health, legal processes, children, and all of that is set to increase as lockdown eases. We're not seeing any sign of it decreasing at all. We're also seeing things like backlogs in welfare benefit systems are hugely impacting women who are saying to us that they just haven't got any money to get them from month to month because their universal credit claim is on hold, for example, whilst lockdown has impacted on various government departments. So the impact of lockdown is affecting women in lots and lots of different ways, and we're trying to mop up and support them as best we can. And you know, I really do feel that this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of demand we're going to be seeing. And it's frightening times for us. It is very frightening times for those women as well.
Gabriel, are you back online?
I'm back in the room. Thank you very much. And sorry to do that to you, Madeline. I knew we should have thanked the tech team before at the beginning of the meeting, but what can I do? But thank you for that. And I apologize for that technical slip up. If I can bring back the conversation, can you just tell me, have we had the question from David Shamash yet? No. Okay, so let's go to a question now from David Shamash. And this is on a question from him. Do you think life will ever be the same as it was before the virus? And what have we learned which might improve our lives when the virus threat is over? I wonder who's going to take that first. Naomi, do you want to take that?
I'm quite happy to go. I think that's a really big question, David, and it's certainly one that we've all been thinking about. I think in terms of work-life balance, and I'm not specifically talking about the women that Jewish Women's Aid supports, but I'm talking about staff and anybody in a work environment. You know, being able to work from home has its pluses and its minuses, and that flexibility that we've all been afforded. You know, for example, in reference to what Rachel was saying about children kind of dashing into court hearings in the background, I feel that we've all become a little bit more flexible and understanding and much more authentic in terms of bringing our whole person to work, and I think that will stay with us to a certain extent. You know, organisations are not rushing back into the workplace, and that's going to take a while before we're even able to work as we were before, and so we will have to continue to adapt, and that I think will be a change that stays with us.
Laurie, can I come to you?
Yeah, I think there's going to be an awful lot of positives, and I just hope that some of the positives we're already seeing last long lasting as well. I think one of the key things for me is we're getting used to living in uncertainty and not just following a playbook and have a plan for the medium-term plan of the next year or 2 years or 5 years. And I think that's a really healthy thing to really focus on the here and now. I think there's also a big element, as I mentioned at the start, that we're working with an awful lot of people that have been spent years and years and years feeling that they're isolated from the community. And there are so many resources that are now being put in place by all sorts of social care organisations and synagogues and youth movements and schools and all sorts of online resources and other ways of engaging with people and using the social capital of our community to go and have chats with people and deliver pharmaceutical supplies and groceries, etc. And I think so all those things that are put in place to combat isolation, I think maybe the lovely thing, that the real challenge for our community is as we come out, and we hope will come out of isolation as soon as possible and lockdown is lifted, that all those people that have been isolated for years and years and years have the ability and have the resources to be able to come out of isolation with the rest of us.
Thank you for that. And I also wonder, because we've all had a shared experience of isolation, we're all now charged, I think, that there is not, I wouldn't say violence part of the human condition, or maybe we could say it is, but there seems to be a kind of a violence in the air in terms of, particularly in Hampstead, there was a lot of graffiti on the walls, for example, which we spotted straight after everybody was on release, as it were. And the Black Lives Matter movement, there was certainly a lot of violence on the street here and around the world. And one imagines that this is a peculiarity of us all having a lockdown experience and then being released. Is there going to be something that we need to be aware of about the human condition, which perhaps is going to be a little bit frightening? Rachel?
Well, I think most people's hope is the opposite to that. That it's actually the neighbourhood organisations that have built up, helping the vulnerable and the elderly, that Laurie was referring to, that some of those local organisational groups will continue beyond the COVID lockdown, and that there will be a gentleness and perhaps a more kindness in society rather than more violence and aggression. So I'm not sure that there is any evidence that, any real evidence that lockdown has produced more violence and aggression, except in the domestic setting, which Naomi's already referred to.
Thank you. I want to go back to the early days of the lockdown and how people were thinking. And I want to share with you the words of Gloria Tesla, a journalist, who wrote this: "Being apart can bring us together. It can also make us conscious of every living thing, every smile that you miss on the faces of your friends or family, the songs of the birds, and even the daffodils fading in the vase." I think that a lot of people experienced a profound rethinking of what life is all about. And I remember I was in quite strict isolation myself. And it was one of those beautiful days that we all experienced. And we were able to go for a walk around the block. And I noticed all the flowers blooming and the trees. I looked up at the sky and didn't see any aeroplanes. I live near quite a big main busy road, and there were no cars on the road, so there was no pollution in the air. And I thought it was a rather wonderful thing to experience. And I wonder if that's going to change people. Will they remember what they lived through in a positive sense? And I wonder, if, Rachel, if that's more what you were trying to say.
I think obviously what I come across in the courts are the families that are falling apart and where there's real difficulty and trouble. So it's not in my working life, but I think lots of families where adult children have come back to live at home who weren't living at home before because of the lockdown, where families who were living in different units have pulled together and have lived together in lockdown together. All those are potential benefits, and certainly people driving less, walking more, exercising more, and just noticing more is very real, because lots of the other diverting stimulus that we're all constantly diverted by were taken away, and I think a lot of people found that a very intense experience. But I think it's a luxury to be able to experience it in that way, and it's the users of the court and the users of JAMI and Jewish Women's Aid do not have those luxuries.
Yeah.
But Laurie, can I come to you? Because if we experienced a heightened sense of what we thought was good about the world, and suddenly things start to go back, the cars are back on the road, the aeroplanes back in the sky, and all the rest of it, will there be a tendency for depression to set in because of the new reality that we find ourselves in?
I think we need to be very careful here, and I appreciate that. Some people did have wonderful, calm Zen-like experiences of walking around and smelling roses. But I have to say, one of the most frustrating things I've heard during this is lines like "we're all in this together." We were not all in this together. The vastly different experience of some of our service users, some of those people using Jewish Women's Aid services. It really is a different experience. I remember I was climbing 5 flights of stairs in a tower block in East London to deliver a tablet computer and the meal and chat that I described earlier, to be greeted by a gentleman in his underpants who had not seen anybody for 4 or 5 days. And the conversations were just taking place at that time about, were people using parks too much, and And in the main, the people on social media that were complaining about the use of parks had wonderful gardens and lovely houses, and it's a completely different experience. If you're living in a tower block, you should be allowed to use the parks, almost regardless of how many people are there. And if you've got your own garden, do not use it. And I think that the different experience of so many people in our society is what we really need to refer to. And you're absolutely right. The prevalence of depression and anxiety is on the rise, but I don't believe it's on the rise because people have had wonderful furloughed experiences of smelling the roses, and now the fumes are coming back from the cars. That's not the problem, if only it was.
I think, of course, all these things are very complex, and I'm not suggesting one particular experience is going to be the end. Everybody's have the same kind of experience, but I think we need to take little individual ideas and experiences and see where they lead to. And I think we can see some positives and some negatives. And of course, this issue is very, very complex. For example, if I stick on the mental health issue for a moment, people with autistic spectrum conditions, some may be thriving in this era, and others may be really suffering. So we shouldn't go to the headlines and say one size fits all. And I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Oh, no, absolutely. And in terms of, for instance, social anxiety, particularly young people with social anxiety, it's been actually a really good period being in lockdown, because all the pressures of social interaction, going out and everything that they felt was expected of them has been taken, has effectively been taken away. But that will come back as soon as lockdown is lifted. All that's going to come back. It hasn't gone away. And I refer to the comment I made earlier about the prevalence of depression and anxiety amongst those caring for family members. We've seen almost doubling just in the month of June of the referrals we get from carers and family members. So the impact's not just on those with the significant mental health issues, but all those surrounding them and all those networks is going to be significant.
I'm desperately trying to find some good news here, so I'm getting pulled back all the time. But I'm going to try with you. I'm going to try with you. No, I knew this was going to happen, but it's fair enough. But Naomi, what I wanted to challenge you a little bit as well. I'm going to say that there must be stories of husbands and wives who couldn't stand the sight of each other, and then found that they had to live with each other in lockdown. And I just wonder whether in your experience, were there any examples of people actually sorting out their differences because they just quite frankly had to rely on each other?
Gabriel, I'm sorry, I can't. I'm not going to be the one to give a good news story here. I'm sure that is the case. I think, COVID has been an immensely sad and tragic experience for many, many people across the country and in the Jewish community. Somebody said we're all in the same storm but in different ships, and I think that's really, really been demonstrated very clearly from what Rachel and Laurie have said, and also from what we've seen at Jewish Women's Aid. We don't work with people whose marriages are in difficulties. We deal with abusive marriages, abusive relationships where they've passed a point of no return, and where there's an imbalance of power and control, where the person who is the victim of the abuse is unable to push back and regain any control in her relationship. It is highly unlikely, therefore, that any of the women that we're working with are going to have what you might have thought of as a happy ever after with her partner. But what we do see, and this probably is a little bit more cheerful, is countless inspirational stories of women regaining their sense of self and finding the person they want to be and moving on to a life free from fear and away from any more abuse in their life. And we work with them to give them the therapy and support so they can do that, and that their children can be taken on that journey with them. And for us, that's a success and that's a happy ending.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that. We have
Gabriel, I can give you a positive as well.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
Well, we're always trying to, Pollyanna coming back into the room. The very fact that we're having this conversation is really, really important. And I don't know what Hampstead Synagogue's plans were for the end of June and July, but I dare say pre-COVID you weren't planning on this kind of event. And for both JWA's work and the work that we're doing at JAMI, it's really important that the community is educated, spends time discussing, understands, and just talks about these issues. And so it really is a positive aspect to this, that we're having these conversations. And I'm sure Naomi's the same as me. I've been having these conversations once or twice a week in the evening with different groups, and that is a really, really positive thing.
Thank you very much for that too.
Perhaps I could come in there. Yes, the only crumb of comfort that I can give in looking for a positive slant is that when things do go wrong in families, the religious communities do have more backup than other people that come before the courts. Obviously, Jewish Care has a lot of resources that they're sometimes able to offer to these families. In housing, there are often more options than there might be to people who don't form part of any faith community. In social services, there's support. So there are advantages in the organisation of the community itself that have really stepped up during the crisis and are in the background to support members of our community and members of other religious communities that aren't available to people who don't form part of those communities.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to come to synagogues in a moment, if I may, but there is a question that's come through us on the social media regarding family members, so which I would like to put to you. And the question is, how can we help family members, either our kids or parents, that may be feeling fearful about the ease of lockdown? And I think what that's getting at is perhaps we're feeling a bit of Stockholm syndrome here. We're actually a bit set in our ways because of our experience, our individual experience. And how can we help the family out of this environment back into some form of normality? Who should I go to first? Laurie?
Happy to answer it. Or I should prefix this with, we employ, I think it's 54 clinical mental health staff, and I'm not one of them. So I'm not the best person to answer in terms of a very specific clinical answer to this. But in the main, it's okay to feel anxious and upset by a situation and uncertain about a situation. And the most important thing is to talk about it. In a huge number of mental health situations, the problem is caused by people not getting support early on, not feeling able to talk about it, bottling things up and sweeping issues under the carpet. So I think a lot of that's happening now is as you would expect to feel under the circumstances. I'm very conscious that I'm very mindful of a conversation I had with somebody. It's going to sound like it's all East London that I went to, but this is another conversation I had in East London during the pandemic, where I met with a woman who's been using our services for some time, and I said to her, and it's a brave person that says in this current climate, how are you doing? But I said, how are you? And she threw it straight back to me and she said, Laurie, how are you feeling? How are you? And I said, well, I'm feeling uncertain, anxious, nervous, scared. And she said, that's exactly how I feel. And I've been feeling like that for 20 or 25 years. And there's something about, again, you were looking for the positive, Gabriel, that we're all getting a little bit of a dose of that. And that's really, really important. And in fact, this woman has actually developed all sorts of skills to combat those kind of feelings and how to manage her condition. And I think we can all learn a little bit of that. But I think some of those things, yes, it doesn't matter. It's about, talk about it, acknowledge those feelings, and accept that there's nothing wrong with having those feelings.
Yeah, and I think that's what people said at the time, is okay to be scared. It's okay to do things at your own speed and your own time. And I just had a little twinge of it myself. I was quite in strict lockdown and decided not to go into any shops. And then I decided to give myself permission to go back into shops again. Mm-hmm. And it took me 2 days to get over that. First day I went into a shop and didn't buy anything. It just had a walk around. And it took me the second day to buy something. Pretty awful, but anyway. Yeah. So that we have to learn how to work in the real world again. But it's also it's going to be slow.
But also not necessarily to feel that you have to compare yourself with what everyone else is doing. I think the initial stages of lockdown were almost easier because very strict rules. Don't go out. Very simple instructions from the government. Stay at home. It's when there's an element of choice and judgment that's brought in that I think things are problematic, and then people feel that society is kind of full of issues that have come out of people competing and comparisons. And coming out of lockdown is just the same. Some people will feel anxious about going into a shop, other people won't. That doesn't matter. It's what's right for you and your family, and it's important not to compare yourself all the time in that sense.
Exactly so. Can I come to Rachel and ask you the same question? What advice would you give people coming out of families, particularly coming out of lockdown?
Well, in the family courts, what we're doing all the time really is a risk analysis. You're looking at risks and trying to balance competing risks. And the risk has changed externally. You look at the figures and you have to believe in the figures that the risk has lessened. And therefore you make a proportionate response to that in what it is that you feel is safe to do and what is not safe to do. So I think that the very real information that you have and the scientific information and the choices that you make as a consequence of that information change as the hold of the virus lessens in various parts of the country. And obviously we all have to listen to that advice.
I want to go back to Laurie. I'm not sure that the government advice was as clear-cut as you make it sound. I think there was a lot of ambivalence and people had to really work out what was being said half the time.
I think you're right, but at least stay at home was a lot clearer than stay alert.
Yes, I think you're probably right. That's true. Naomi, I suspect that you're going to have some advice for people who maybe have been suffering in the family. Is there a special advice for them as they emerge out of lockdown?
Yes, I think it's going to be difficult. As I said, we know that there's hundreds and thousands of women living with abusive men at the moment. And my advice would be make sure that you get specialist support from an agency that can help you, whether that's Jewish Women's Aid or another domestic abuse agency. Making plans to leave and actual leaving itself can be a really, really dangerous time, because it's a point when a perpetrator of abuse can sometimes, and there's lots of studies to prove this, becoming more aggressive and more violent and more abusive. So I would always say if somebody is wanting to get help and support, particularly to leave an abusive relationship, they should do it carefully and in conjunction with professionals who can help them and hold their hands every step of the way.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to the early days again of lockdown, and I want to share with you what Ellie Cohen, a doctor and broadcaster, wrote. And this is what it says. The resilience of, and this is about the closure of synagogues, by the way, when we had to close all the synagogues in the United Kingdom. The resilience of the community has been put at stake. The people who go to shul, go to synagogue, for comfort, for solace, to escape abusive partners, to escape their real life, to be mindful, to have something to eat, or just to speak to someone once a week. And then it goes on to say, people like myself working in mental health and the NHS will be dealing with the fallout from this decision long after we have dealt with Corona. I'm just reflecting on that and wonder we know the importance of the synagogue to the Jewish community. We are a faith community. How have the faith community come up to the challenge of the closure of the synagogues, in your opinion? I wonder if Laurie, you can start with that. Well,
I think I absolutely agree with part of that question. The synagogue buildings have closed, but the synagogue communities have not. And I think the support that people get from their synagogues and from their faith communities is from the community. It's not from the bricks and mortar of the building. And that's really, really important. And I think it's been really heartening to see how an awful lot of communities have come together, offering all sorts of support in all sorts of different capacities. So I think one of the challenges I don't think it's the fault of closing the shuls that has been the issue. Indeed, I think one of the problems now with all the talk about opening synagogues back up is that it's not going to be meaningful opening. It's not going to actually impact on these people who are getting that kind of support. And the drive should be on the support that the community gives the individuals, not on physically opening the doors of those synagogues.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think in terms of Hampstead Synagogue, I think that we stopped becoming a congregation and we became a community. I really do. In the first weeks or so, volunteers were coming to us and they were saying, how can we help our community? And I had a meeting with the community, the volunteers, only last couple of weeks ago, I think. 2 meetings, where we had we only could have half and half. And the volunteers said that they got so much out of being able to phone our members up and to actually offer some support to them. It wasn't an onus or a responsibility. They really enjoyed it. And I think this experience has got its positives, and I think that's probably one of them. And I think that's something that we need to continue for a long time to come, because I think learning how to become a community, being a bit stronger in our sense of community, our sense of family, is something that I think we should aspire to. Naomi, in your experience, I don't know whether you're a member of a synagogue or not, but how do you think the faith communities have coped under this?
Well, I am a member of a synagogue, and you know, mine and others have done exactly what you've modelled so brilliantly, Gabriel, which is making sure that people got a phone call and there were willing people to make those phone calls, and that contact has been absolutely critical. It's been a real lifesaver. You know, in the absence of bumping into people and seeing people, this is a really, really important way of staying in touch. And in my synagogue particularly, we've made sure that the people who've been making the phone calls haven't necessarily been friends with the people who they have been calling, just so that new ties and new relationships can form. And that's been really important. And earlier today, in fact, I was on a call with some people from other faiths. And it sounds like some of the Muslim communities are doing similar things to us, in that they're trying to stay engaged with their congregants, but in different ways, in the knowledge that actually shul is not just somewhere to go to pray. It's a community centre. It's a place we socialise. It's a place where we get support. It's a place where we make friends. And that's something that we can try really hard to sustain whilst we're not physically close to each other.
Thank you. And Rachel, I don't again know your experience at all, but is there anything that you can say about the faith communities?
Well, one thing that I thought was quite interesting was the NHS volunteer scheme that, you know, within, I think, 48 hours had 750,000 people registering for that scheme, which then was unable to really organise and deliver that number of volunteers with meaningful tasks. So I think that the willingness in the general community, as well as within the faith communities, to actually give, if there is a structure and a way that they can do so, is enormous out there. And I think that to try and harness some of that in the secular community as well as in the religious communities would be another win from this. I mean, it was an extraordinary outpouring of goodwill, and it would be a great loss not to be able to harness that in some way.
Thank you very much for that. And you've still got a chance out there in internet land to put your questions or thoughts to our panel. And we have a question now from, I believe, David Simmons. And he asked this: do you think the government considered the mental health impacts of social distancing, not being able to hug an elderly parent, meet your newborn grandchild, and so on? Laura, I think that's a question for you.
Trying to remain firmly apolitical. It's not for me to comment on what the government were really considering. I think, to be fair, the very use of the term social distancing was unfortunate. I tried, and colleagues tried at JAMI from the outset, to refer to physical distancing, not social distancing, which I think is a very important distinction. I think, to be honest, it's been a huge balance. And I think there is an acknowledgement. One of the positive things that's come out of the pandemic is an acknowledgement that the mental health of society is really, really important. And it has been a parallel conversation with the pandemic. Whether or not they gave it enough priority, we're only going to know if we look back in a couple of years' time and look at the real impact of what happened here, the balance between the viral impact the mortality, mental health, economics. There's such a wealth of different ways that society is impacting. You know, even mortality is not affected just by the virus. It's affected directly by mental health. It's affected indirectly by mental health because of redundancies and financial implications and domestic abuse. I think it's a good question, but impossible to answer in really succinct fashion.
What's great, Laurie, is you've got a clock on the wall behind you, so I don't have to look at my watch. So I hope it's accurate, and I know that I have to speed things up if we're going to cover as many things as we can. So I'm going to ask different questions, if I may. And I've got a question here from Pamela Rose, and she said, courts were being sold off and judges not being asked to sit in Crown courts. And have been asked for, it says, we have been asked for additional buildings to cope with the backlog. What's the current situation with that? And is there going to be a reappraisal of the judicial system, do you think, in this country?
Well, on the specific issue of the question, which is really on the selling off of court buildings, there are discussions afoot, but they are funding dependent on whether or not other buildings, larger buildings, more suitable buildings can be used to try to erode the huge backlog of cases that's built up in all forms of court, but particularly in the criminal courts. So there are no decisions that I'm yet aware of, but certainly there will be an attempt to tap into the enormous infrastructure building programme that Boris Johnson's been referring to in the last few days to improve the infrastructure of courts and court buildings. Whether that will succeed, whether they will get a slice of the pie, I have no knowledge.
Thank you very much. And Naomi, if I can come to you next. Denise Lester says, what about the impact on children? Can you comment on the lack of school, for example? How is that going to be an impacting on children?
Well,
perhaps on development as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a child development specialist, but I am a mum of 4 children, and also I have got lots and lots of children who Jewish Women's Aid is giving therapy to at the moment, and I don't think it's been easy for them. You know, what we've seen, and I know socially as well, some children are fine with no structure, and some children really struggle with no structure, and this really also I think is where there's been a real divide in terms of on the socioeconomic lines. So some schools, private schools, have been sending a huge amount of work home and giving a lot of support to children, and other schools have sent significantly less, and so what we're seeing is that poorer children are getting less education, having fewer school meals. We saw that amazing campaign the other week by Marcus Rashford, which is going to make a massive difference over the summer holidays. You know, I think time will tell, really, and it will depend on the circumstances of the child, and also the child themselves, how resilient they are, how bright they are, how quickly they catch up, what facilities are in place when they eventually do go back. And we know that some children have gone back and some haven't. And I do think, like Laurie's saying, it's the long game, and there's going to be a lot of analysis afterwards and a lot of support that's needed for children and their families going forward.
And perhaps
sorry, go. Yeah, sure, Rachel.
If I can add to that one of the really heartbreaking aspects of the lockdown was parents who were separated from their children by the courts, either babies removed because of drug and alcohol or mental health misuse of their parents, and other children were unable to see those children. And for mothers who could only see their babies on Zoom or on some social media where the child themselves could not respond to it, was a really heartbreaking aspect of it, and what the long-term implications of that for the bonding of those relationships, we won't know for quite a long time.
Thank you very much for that. Right, I'm going to try to force all 3 of you to end on a really positive note. All right, that's the challenge. Now, you don't have to talk about the institutions that you think that you're representing tonight. You can talk on a personal basis if that might help you. But I want to end by quoting Jennifer Lippman, a columnist, a newspaper columnist. Again, this is the early weeks of lockdown, and she wrote this. And I'm afraid I'm going to use a swear word, and I hope there are no young children listening. The word is unprecedented. And you're not just sick and tired of hearing that word, but nonetheless. This unprecedented crisis could be a chance to build Jewish life in Britain as it could be and become a stronger community, one that remains giving and generous, but becomes more flexible, innovative, and dynamic. Then we can tell our children about the aftermath of this war and the good it led to. So what could the community become? That's the question. Can I go to Rachel first?
Well, we've already talked about some of the social aspect advantages during lockdown of people becoming more involved in neighbourhood initiatives, contacting people local to them. And I suppose the challenge is how to grow those whilst reopening some of the institutions as we're able to do so. So to keep the good of it without and the best of it, whilst not losing the importance that the physical structures also have in the communities, because they're always the people that will struggle to access social media for a whole variety of reasons. The elderly in the community, that face-to-face contact's always going to be the right thing for them. But the contacts that are made, the huge amount of people who might have an interest in voluntary work and see the pleasure that it brings them, as well as that may be the long-term good that comes out of it.
Great,
Yes,
thank you for that. Naomi, over to you.
I agree, Rachel. I think this has given us an opportunity to hear those people in the community who've previously felt unheard, to see the unseen, to listen and to see what issues are happening in the community. You know, as Laurie said, we've got an opportunity to talk about issues in domestic abuse and in mental health, but more than that, you know, people who are volunteering and really being commended for it. The welfare aspect of our community is just on an unbelievable level. People are volunteering the whole time to do many different things, and let's not forget the charitable giving that's happened to charities like us, like JAMI, Jewish Care. You know, the outpouring of support has been really quite overwhelming. You know, I think we all need to thank the community for that. It's certainly something that I wouldn't have necessarily expected, particularly given the pending difficult times ahead. But, you know, this community has so much going for it. The cohesive ties that are not physical, that bind us, not necessarily in our buildings, are really something that I think we can draw a lot of strength from at this point.
Yes, I think you're right. And there's a news story, I can't remember all the details, but the Hasmonean school was under serious threat of closure because they didn't have the money, and they did an appeal, and I think that they managed to raise £1 million within a very short space of time. Yeah, so the community is there. Laurie, can I come to you?
Absolutely. I completely concur with Rachel and Naomi, and apologies, I think I've got the tail end of an hour of keeping my 4 kids quiet and failing that one. But I think one of the key things is almost priming the community to give it the skills to support and understand the importance of supporting itself. Whatever amazing work that the different social care organisations do in the community, and I agree with Naomi, you know, I'm just so thankful for working in the community and the support that we continue to get from the community. But what amazing work we can do. We might do it on, you know, the interventions that we might have, the interactions we might have with our service users are once, twice, 3 times a week for those using our services most regularly. But all the other interactions that they have with the community are what's really going to be powerful and what's really going to use the social capital of the community. And it's the language people use, and it's the understanding of different people's circumstances. I mentioned that we've given a lot of tablet computers out, and yes, people might be engaging with 2 or 3 group sessions and a couple of one-to-ones, but what we're finding is friendship circles are developing and people are in touch with their communities with the tools that we've given them. It's the old adage of don't give someone a fish, teach them how to fish. And I think that's something that the community really is getting. And the other thing, again, on the back of what Naomi says, as someone that came from the commercial sector into the third sector and knowing the problems that sometimes we have of recruiting, you know, really capable staff and demonstrating that this is a career and something really valuable for the community. This has proved this because, you know, the community is applauding health and social care workers, and hopefully we won't have the same challenges in recruiting, because people will see that this is what is important in society. And some of the other things that might have maximised people's wealth in the short term, maybe they're not secure jobs, and you don't really feel you'll get the meaning from what you're doing. So I think hopefully that will help as well in terms of encouraging particularly young people to pick health and social care as a profession.
Well, thank you very much. You came up to the challenge, a positive side to end with. I'm going to ask Madeline to come in now, and I promise that I'm not going to give any more surprises to her. So thank you, Madeline. Over to you.
I just want to thank our panelists very much for participating today. I hope that the extra awareness it's given to both JAMI and to JWA and to the way our courts work through Rachel Karp has proved useful to both those charities. I'm delighted to hear that you're being positive at the end, as charities obviously are very concerned about their fundraising in order to carry on their amazing services, which they have described as bound to go up as lockdown eases. So as a community, we mustn't forget our charities. So thank you very much to the participants. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for putting this programme together. I mean, the whole programme of the Where Are We Now, and for your constant optimism. You invite a domestic abuse agency and JAMI looking at mental illness and want positive results. Thank you to our tech team, headed by Leo Mindell, who keeps this thing together. And just want to tell you about the next event in our series, which will be on July the 16th, that's in 2 weeks' time, when we will be speaking to Michael Goldstein, who is president of the United Synagogue. So Thursday, 16th July, same time, 8 p.m. We look forward to seeing you all then. And thanks again to Naomi Dickson, to Laurie Rackind, and to Rachel Karp. And good night to all.